I'd like to thank all of our speakers for this afternoon sessions and all of our guests. And it sounded like maybe we need to have some more boxes of Kleenex in the room for the memories and so forth. Today, right now, we're going to get down to some ideas, though. Like what made these guys famous? The things that they thought about, the things that they wrote about, the things that they think are the challenges for the world of education in the future. So we have our distinguished panel up here, and Julie and I are going to fire questions at them in a Chris Matthews style hardball round.
I'll be Oprah.
No, we're going to lob softballs at them.
Speaking of which?
Yes, we can pass this around if you want. We have an ELPA faculty tradition of when we get together for a faculty retreat, we bring some sporting object. They're all over on the back deck there if you want to look at them, and have everybody sign them. And it turns out to be like that's sort of our ELPA yearbook. This one is from an I don't know what, like prehistoric time. Well, I don't know any of the names on here, but some of you have been around for a while.
He signed it.
Nicknames.
Nicknames. Does anybody know who Squeaker is?
Yeah, who's Squeaker?
I don't know who Squeaker is.
No.
Spider?
No takers for Squeaker. I mean, Silk is on there. I would take Silk.
Squeaker?
That's a cool name.
Squeaker's capper.
No, not Dinny. Ditty.
Because I signed the thing, so it was
You
when I
know
was
who?
here.
What?
Who's Ditty, Paul?
Squeaker, isn't that capper?
Oh, maybe. I don't know.
It could be. Could be.
So,
Okay.
Okay. So we'll bring this ball back at the next ELPA Festschrift, and then it'll
Then
be
we'll
Colleen
know,
will
right?
know.
Yeah, there are 3 others from this era.
Yeah, so
And we also, during this era that I think started with Julie when she was chair, the department now has a gavel collection. And Rich
also doubles as a croquet mallet.
is going to, the gavel collection is on display as well, and Rich will use that to keep the discussion
Yes.
moving.
Alan just woke up, so. All right, so the first question we like to ask our panelists is, what do you consider as the central contribution that you've made to education research and really to advancing schools in your career? We'll start off with a soft one, right? So let's start, which one of you distinguished gentlemen wants to start off with this one? Go ahead, Al.
Well, I think it's fairly indirect, but when you're around great faculty colleagues and really great students, it's like showing up every day, and it's real easy to get in the car and get here and, you know, go to meetings and think and do some reading and have plan for class and have class. I mean, just showing up when you have this great environment and these great colleagues, I mean, it's just fun to do. And I mean, the ideas here compared to ideas I've seen and worked with elsewhere before I came here, it's just it's incredibly different, you know, and it's hard to capture the difference between this place and other Big Ten Midwest schools and even some East Coast schools that I've worked at, you know. But anyway, it's just, I mean, this was always a fabulous place to be, and I've always enjoyed it and always got a lot out of it and hope that I contributed something along the way.
Paul, let's give you a shot at this one.
Totally dodged the question.
oh, I'm sorry, I'm busy. I'm working.
He can do what he wants.
Yeah.
He's not going to be on the show again.
Next time it'll be your turn.
He can even do a handstand.
First of all, let me say hi från Oslo till min kollega in Madison. And you can ask Jay Stampen what I'm talking about, or Odden. He's a Norwegian, he'll know. But at any rate, it's wonderful to be with you. Now, in terms of contributions, I guess what I would say is that for me, it's always been about being able to think in a variety of different ways about the nature of our field. And for me, it actually resided in my literature background in poetry and my fondness for architecture. And they became lenses for me to help examine the link between leadership and learning. And I've never been able to separate those, because I think sometimes we think about our field as kind of a technical or technocratic field, but I really see it as much more dynamic and poetic than perhaps most people. And some people might say romantic or sentimental, but I think it's really important for us to always key in on that link between leadership and learning. That's what we're about.
Nice. Nice. Kent, you're probably in that ballpark. You want to try to tackle this one?
42.
You just hit a home run, Jackie.
Right.
Congratulations.
Well, in addition to just the contribution through working with students who have had an incredible impact on my own work. In our meeting, we were talking about how they like to come talk to me. Boy, I love to hear them talk about the realities of their work, and it helped me understand the complexities of it. But then I was able to bring, I think one contribution is just raising the awareness of the complexity of principals' work on a daily basis. And I know Rich is doing some incredible work, continuing, not on my work, but on, looking at that. But just raising, the awareness of how complex it is to lead a school, and to appreciate on the practice side that we need to support these people. The other piece, I think, I really have to thank Terry Deal for and NIE, which is the old U.S. Department of Education's Research Center, because I learned about school culture from Terry Deal initially when I was leading the Principals Institute, and we would argue because he would say school culture is 90% of productivity, and I would argue that instructional leadership, curriculum, and quality instruction was equally important, or was more important. And so we argued about it. And the reason that the National Institute of Education was important is that they asked Terry to write a paper, a conceptual paper on school culture, and they asked me to write a separate paper on 5 cases, which, when you send them to the U.S. government, they go into the maw and disappear. Someone happened to see the 2 of those pieces and put them together into a book. And that started our discussion about school culture, which, I think deepened through my discussions with people in practice about positive and toxic cultures. So that writing, I think, on school culture and principals' work, not only hope has helped in practice, but is has helped move the field forward in looking at some of these organizational issues.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, Allan.
I'd like to build on what Paul and Kent have said to not only answer the first question, but the second one that's on the list. And the quick answer to the first question for me in terms of central contribution is a single word. And that word is praxis, the relationship between theory and practice. The relationship between research and research findings on the one hand, and what people are actually doing, the way in which it works in the real world. And so in many of the things that I've done over the years, that relationship, that praxis, has consistently been very important to me in terms of what I valued, and it seems to have been a major benefit to other people as well. Second question has to do not with contribution, but with challenge. And I'd like to go back to Julie's downer earlier, the fourth point regarding the purpose of education and society and democracy and so on, and to make the following observation, that preparatory education of young people is very important. I value it highly. I've been part of it in a number of ways over the years and so on. But the other half of education is continuing education of adults. And the people who are involved, the money that's involved, the importance of society is about equal to preparatory education of young people. But it's very differently organized. It is very decentralized. There are many, many different organizations and groups that provide educational opportunities for adults. So when I take those two areas, the best advice I have for anybody trying to do something about reform of preparatory education of adults is to help to bring together those two halves, to recognize that it's the people who are involved in all sorts of organizations, public and private and local and national and international and so on, having to do with lifelong learning for adults. These are the people who can, if they're working together with the people in preparatory education of young people, the reference to children and young people and so on as the learners in Julie's comments before, those are the people who stand any chance, if our society stands any chance at all, in turning things around, in reforming, in coming back to looking at education as a lifelong activity, as important to democracy, and dealing with the collective investments that are involved and the benefits that come from that and so on, in contrast with the move in recent generation or two towards a polarization that's occurring under the worst of circumstances in other parts of the world, and increasingly the tribal mentality and so on occurring within the United States. And Julie's several efforts recently to talk about ALEC and what's helping to orchestrate this at big time and so on is a part of that. And if more and more people concerned with adult continuing education, with the media and so on, could resonate with that and help to deal at the grassroots level with that effort, it would help to raise the consciousness of our society to what's being done in that situation that Julie referred to with cartoons and very seriously before, and make progress on that sort of reform. So I see that as the biggest obstacle or challenge that I see for education, not only research, but practice, and for society as well. So. Got two of them out of the way.
Right. Thanks, Alan. Alan, would you take
First, a comment, just so everybody knows that all the Allans are retiring.
That was a criteria for selection
exactly. Then. And three-fourths of the Scandinavian caucus in the department is retiring. So it's a huge loss. I mean,
that's right.
But we do have 2 Peters now.
Yeah, but if I'd stayed, there would have been 3 Peters or Petersons.
Okay.
Oh, that's true.
I felt I needed to leave.
As did I. I want to pick up on what Alan Knox said on praxis. When I took my first school finance class, it was all about tax issues, property tax burdens, etc., and more money, and just school finance formulas and more money. And what I've tried to do, and worked with a lot of people who were at our small session, tried to link what works in schools with a funding system. And that's been, I think, a big contribution, a big change, and I hope people continue on that kind of work going forward. And then the other part on teacher compensation, which was kind of the other area of, major area of my work, what I say is that new approaches to teacher compensation, generally merit-based, sort of popped up on policy agendas in the last half of the 20th century like locusts about every 7 years. It would pop up there, people would get all excited, and then it would die because the ideas were all nutty. But after we started our work, and just so people know, we started with a series of seminars with the NEA and the AFT leaders and the National Board, and we translated ideas from other places into education, and the idea has stuck on the agenda that we can change the way we pay teachers, not only more money, but in better ways to allocate the money. And there's been just lots of efforts across the country. That issue's not gone away. And it's now married with teacher evaluation, but I would say, so we had an impact there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. So Alan has already foreshadowed the second question that we know, but you don't. But the second question for you to address then is, what do you see as the biggest obstacle or challenge to change in education research and reform? And I don't know, would you want to go back down the other way? That's right.
I would say 2 things. well, maybe three things. One is, this is on the resource allocation side. Too many people think that unless you get more money, you can't do anything. Now, a lot of places need more money, but every place, I think, can use the money they have more effectively. Pat Nudeker is testimony to that. So I think trying to lay out an agenda that shows whatever your budget is, there's more effective different things you can do. The other one is to make this link between trying to structuring research so that it's useful in the world of practice. So a lot of the work that Jeffrey Borman is doing is on things that work, or to try to find out what does work. Does full-day kindergarten work versus half-day? Does X versus Y work? Rather than just a theoretical approach to it, or just a regression-y coefficient which is positive. And when you say, well, what exactly does that mean in a school district or a school? And the answer is, we're not quite sure, but why don't you try it and then we'll research that. We'll do a study to see if it works. So I think trying to bring it down to kind of really practical things and getting evidence on whether or not it does work, and if so, how much it works.
Nice. Yeah.
Thank you. Kent?
Oh. Well, I think one of the biggest obstacles right now is, funding for basic research, on what do principals do, what's effective teaching look like. We just don't, there is so much money out there for other kinds of research and purchasing, military purchasing that could be, I think could be reallocated to educational research that really makes a difference. Well, we got one here.
Just one clapping. I think there's more than one.
And I don't know if this is an obstacle or part of the culture of research right now. I agree that I think it's useful to look at what works. But I think it's useful to look at just what is going on in schools. What is our basic knowledge about schools? Cancer researchers don't just look at what drugs work. They look at they get funding for this, looking at the structure of molecules in cancer cells, which is really basic research. And so much of our research right now, and I don't know this for sure, but a lot of it seems to be on what reforms, how effective are reforms, how effective are particular programs, not more basic research on the structure of schools, the complexities of managing that kind of an organization. In terms of reform, and I'm probably going to put you all to sleep on this, but it seems right now that a lot of state policies are defining the process of education, what the curriculum is, sometimes instructional strategies, what you need to do in terms of classroom activities, and they're defining the outcomes that you have to get. Now, if you look back on some of the earlier organizational theory on how to control and shape organizations, you either focus on the process when the process is simple, like making tissue paper, and you buy a machine to do the process, and it guarantees the outcome. If the process is complex, like in schools, and you want to improve what schools do, if the process is complex, you oftentimes want to focus on the outcomes and evaluate those and hold people accountable, but then let people decide how to achieve those outcomes. Imagine that, I'm going to try and not simplify, but shorten this, but imagine that some company said to a hedge fund operator, we're going to tell you the process of how to invest your money, and we're going to hold you accountable. They don't do that. They say, we're going to hold you accountable for the outcomes, but you figure out how to do it. And I think in terms of reforms, you can't have both control over the process and control over the outcomes and hope to have some innovative reforms that are successful. That's pretty obscure, isn't it?
You're a professor.
I was a professor.
Al, what do you think about that?
Well, I think I want to echo some of the things that my colleagues have said. I think we are at the point now where we're beginning to understand what works, and the What Works Clearinghouse and some of that mentality has really been helpful. But I think now we need to look beyond that and say, how does it work, or why does it work? What do we get these out? How do we get these same outcomes for low-income kids, and how do we get these same college success opportunities for young men and for young women at this comparable levels? You know, how do we reduce those achievement gaps? And I think the challenge for us in education is, how do we use all of this data that are now in these K-16, K-20 longitudinal data systems at the local level inside the classroom, so that the teacher or the team of teachers understands every one of those kids that walk in the door, and what sorts of strategies can they get by looking at the patterns in their data and sharing that data pattern with other teachers in the school, and then other third grade teachers across the district, and then other third grade teachers across the state. And I think, you know, going back to their initial question, I'll go kind of back in reverse order. I think one of the most important things that this department does and has done, you know, is look at what's going on in the economy. We've had the Center on Education and Work and had it for, you know, 30 years plus now. And so there's always this kind of reflective prism. You know, what kinds of career information do people need to make good decisions as they go to college and as they think about careers? We still in the state, and I think, you know, as a nation, we're getting better at doing assessments with kids when they're in high school about not just which academic aptitudes and college readiness you're level for, but what kinds of career pathways seem to be most congruent with your, you know, instincts and your, you know, aptitudes and abilities. So, you know, we need to think about how to integrate much more carefully the assessment stuff into the data, so that our teachers and our school leaders have the capacity to use that data to overcome those questions. Because I think Julie's right. If we don't figure out a way to get past the, you know, this notion of the widely perverse notion of ideology in education, we have no way to convince the legislators or anybody else that this thing is working. You know, we have to be very smart about our own practice and say to the rest of the community, look, you all have gone to schools, but we're the people who are the professionals that run the schools. You know, we study our own issues. We can figure out how to diagnose problems, analyze trends, and make all students much more successful. And it comes from having every educator be much more data literate than they are now, you know. And I think in a place like this, where you've got a major research university, to turn out undergraduates without a research experience as part of the graduation requirement, whether it's for an undergraduate degree or whether it's a master's degree or whether it's, as we've had, a PhD program and dissertations, I mean, move those ideas down into the practice of the university much more proactively than we have in the past. So,
Paul, did you hear the question since I was here?
Yes, I did hear the question, and thank you, and thanks for all the wonderful comments from my colleagues. I guess I would mention three things. I'd begin, though, with the biggest challenge perhaps being the lack of faith in opportunity and possibility for public education. Call me a cockeyed optimist and a real positive person, but I really think that there is a substantial role. And I know it's easy to get into us or them mentality, but when I look at education and what it does, it's more than just about schools and public or private or whatever it is. It's really about our culture, our society, and what kind of future we want to have. And that really has been brought back to me more spending this year here in Norway and Scandinavia and roving about it and learning a lot about that. The second thing I would mention in terms of reform and research and obstacles and challenges is that I always like to remember in terms of research that the good ideas and concepts in research don't just come from the university. And we're not just the ones handing them down. Some of the work I've done over the years, and the best work, has always been in collaboration with people who are in the field and in schools doing it. And so I've learned much more. So I think we need to be really clear about how we can collaborate and how we can learn from our colleagues who are actually doing that job. So it's not about just us doing the research. And lastly, about the notion of reform. I'll borrow term from an article from a colleague of all of ours, Larry Cuban, who talked about reform again and again and again and again. And, you know, I think a lot of times we just like to do reform because we can change things as opposed to thinking about improvement. And so, you know, maybe we ought to just ban the word reform for a while and just think about how can we improve things and how can we just get down to the work that make that happen. Since this is Festschrift, it's a celebration of work, right?
Yeah. That's nice, Paul. It's a really nice point that you made it with collaboration with practitioners, because as a professor here in Ed Leadership, it's one of the things that I think is the strongest part of all of your work is how much you rely on the best ideas that come out of people in the field and try to make those into practice and integrate the theory-driven work with the field-driven work. It's I mean, as a young professor coming up, it's a really nice model, a place to grow up as a researcher. Yeah. Let's we have another question of where would you like to see the area of research? You've all had really strong research trajectories in the past 20, 30, sometimes 40, 50. I'm looking at you, Allan.
Which one? That's Allan.
You both have gray hair.
If you had a crystal ball here in front of you and you would like to, maybe it wouldn't be a crystal ball, it's a predictive ball, where you would say, where would you like to see your field go, your research interests move in the next 10, 15, 20 years? What are some areas that you think would be really, really important for it to hit?
Come back down the table the other direction again.
Yeah? Yeah, Kent, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. These ideas are really related to my, my own interests, and these are things that I'd like to read about in 5 years. Peter. No, that's all right. One of the questions, it's not so earth-shaking, but for me it's really interesting. It's just how have the new technologies affected the work of principals? And by technologies, I include all of the, not just computer and IT technologies, but curriculum, has a new technology. It's much more defined and structured. New instructional technologies, but also computers, data, smartphones. How have these changed the managerial leadership and political challenges of school principals, and how are they addressing it as a more practical issue? And the reason I say this is, I had a student, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, who studied principals in multiple schools. And one of the main technologies, if I remember her work, that was really helpful were fax machines in all the schools. So they could fax information from one school to the next school that they were going to. They didn't, it was before cell phones, before smartphones. I mean, how do principals now really take advantage of these technologies? And the other one is, again, just a personal interest. So I'm doing some work in a large, very unsuccessful urban district. And there's some schools that we're working with that are really toxic, hostile, negative, almost clinically depressed places. How did these schools become that way over time? And then the other question is to take a look at schools that have toxic cultures and try to find out that have transformed themselves and become more positive. What are the things that teachers and principals and others have done to make a school a more positive place culturally? So,
it's right.
What's the Paxil for schools? My wife's a psychotherapist, and I came home from a school. And I described it, and she said it was. I have to give her credit. She said that sounds clinically depressed. and yeah, where's the Paxil or Prozac for that school? So that was good. Yeah.
Paul, do you want to tackle this question next? Where would you like to see the research in your area move?
Well, given the last part of what I've worked on in my career, especially in the shared leadership in schools and teacher leadership. I would like to see a lot more focus on the concept of leadership as opposed to just leaders themselves, because I think we often kind of attribute it to a position or a position holder, and we don't give enough credit for the embedded capacity in schools and the knowledge and the skills and the commitment that's already there, and how we harness that in meaningful ways to improve the school. The second thing I would say, and I'm really hoping that our field moves toward, is a much more global view of our work. And it's not just that I've been abroad for this year, it's that I just think we have so much to learn from others around the world that when we talk about organizations and purpose and leadership and all of that, we have a lot of listening to do and a lot of learning to do. In this exchange program I've been involved in this year, the great thing about it is, of course, I get to exchange some ideas, but I've done an awful lot of listening also. So I think I would like to see over the next decade to be reading much more about a global sense, which isn't to take our eyes off the local. It's only to learn more and have a much broader view of what the possibilities are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paul. Yeah,
again, I find myself picking up, as I did for a decade, with what Paul just said as being a nice launch for some of my own thoughts as well. One clear area of my own research that would interest me in the coming years or decades or whatever has to do with distributed leadership on behalf of professional development, particularly in the helping professions. And I'm interested in that in terms of the international view of that, as well as what happens locally in the state or nationally or within one country. And the opportunity last summertime to spend a week or two in Istanbul, Turkey, meeting with people there at an international conference, and something similar coming up this fall in Taiwan, provides an opportunity from my standpoint to not only share some thoughts about what's going on in other parts of the world, particularly in the United States, that would be of use to people working in Turkey or in the Middle East or in Taiwan or in Asia generally, but to learn from them as well, and to bring back to people from one location to another some of the good ideas that I'm picking up along the line. So international perspectives, or seeing broadly distributed or shared leadership on behalf of professional development and the various stakeholders that are involved, which would include, for people in education, not only people who are professors and administrators in education, but also the other people who are involved as stakeholders in planning and conducting those programs, including the learners themselves as a stakeholder.
Allan, what do you think?
Well, I take maybe a narrower, pretty down-to-earth approach, and back to the theme I raised earlier. I think we need to know more and more about what works in schools and what the resource dimensions of those strategies or programs or whatever are. And then we know a lot. I think we know a lot about that, but we need to know a lot more. But then once we know more, research on, if the money is provided, how we get school people to use the money in ways that we know work. And in our session this afternoon, we kind of reminisced about, we've been quite successful in many states in getting more money into the schools, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions in Washington State. They're under a court order. But we also, and we had rationales for every hunk of money. And you know, one rationale is tutoring for struggling kids. The first, we know that works. Another one is instructional coaches as part of collaborative work teams. We know that works. Particularly in schools with low-income and minority kids, ELL kids. But when we did the study of when you got money for tutoring, what did you do with it? They didn't use it for tutoring. And they lobbied the legislature to say, let us use it for something else. What?
Give us
Lower class size, which had already been funded. Full-day kindergarten, which had already been funded. Materials and supplies, which was already funded. So we were sort of disappointed. In instructional coaches, a lot of people said, why do we need a coach? Didn't you train them in, in teacher training programs, which is all we can do is send out a good rookie. I mean, we can. So I think translating that, and that's really, I think, at the center of what could be in an ELPA department, because now part of this depends on there being some consensus in academia about whether anything works, and I would say there's I would say less of the consensus than I would hope there would be, but let's assume you could get some kind of a consensus. Then I think the programs have to include when you have money or whatever level of money you have, here are the effective ways to use it. Otherwise, at least on the finance side, we can be pouring more money into schools and, not getting the achievement boost that we need.
Al, what's your take on this question?
Well, similar to what Allan is alluding to, I think we've got lots of...
There are 3 Allans here, so...
He's referring to himself.
I need some help.
AO, the guy on the end who usually beats me at golf, okay? We've got lots of ideas about how to use data and strategies to improve schools, including a lot of Allan's resource reallocation work. But we need communities of people to take those research findings and look at the data and figure out how to make it work. And I think Tony Breik and others at the Carnegie Council have got some things going now on what's called the networked improvement communities, where they're looking at developmental mathematics in community colleges. And roughly a third of the people who come into community colleges these days have to do developmental mathematics, So it's a huge problem for all of us. And they've got conversations going in those colleges between the academic instructors, the English teachers, the math instructors, the developmental ed people, the people in charge of kind of professional development, the people in charge of data systems. They're looking at longitudinal data in the college. They're looking at national longitudinal data, making comparisons, sifting and winnowing. What does this mean in this particular community college? And let's meet and talk about these things and do deep dives into the data to see if this way we did it last semester is getting us any better results this semester. So I think we have to figure out a way from our perspective to study those capacity building strategies. When teams of teachers get together and they do resource reallocation, or they create a networked improvement community in a particular community college or across some community college on a particular content area, how well does that work? How do those capacity building strategies work? I mean, that's what leaders need to do. They need to figure out a way to analyze the current capacity, look at the difference between where they are now as an institution and where they want to go with their students and student success, and figure out a way to get there. So they have to study Tony Breik's model, they've got to study Allan Odden's model, they've got to study all different kinds of models to figure out how to get their community and their educators to advance the learning of these students and these outcomes for these students. And I think people who study those systems are going to be, on the leading edge of educational reform and innovation. Scratch the word reform, Paul.
Let's take a minute, because you've done a lot of listening. Some of you have done some talking today, but see if you have. Do we have questions from our audience that you want to ask our panel? Things that have sort of popped up in your mind, or things that ongoing questions that you have. Anybody? Yeah, Jolando.
Yes. Can you all say how you think Wisconsin Center for Education products and services, YSEPs, which is out of research part, designed to in many ways commercialize educational products and services. How might you see that changing the work of school to ed in general, and what we might position ourselves to do now?
Paul, did you hear that?
I did not. Could someone repeat the question?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. You tell me if I get this right. But we now have the Wisconsin Center for Educational Products and Services, YSEPs, And Orlando asked, how does that availability to commercialize some of the ideas and services that we have, protect and commercialize, thank you. So the ideas that we have, how might that change what happens in the School of Ed and what happens in the department? Did I get that about right?
Yep.
Well, I think, you know, they are in the business of helping us take products that are meaningful and finding a market for those ideas and those products that are attached to the ideas. I think that raises big questions about what I think there's a gap in this culture between the sifting and winnowing ideas and the Wisconsin ideas. And I would like to explicitly connect, you know, theory and research much more closely to public engagement and public use of that knowledge and that new theory that comes out of a research, you know, university. I think that's who we are. I think that's what we need to always let the public know. This is what we do, and this is why educational research done in Madison makes a difference in schools on the south side in Milwaukee, you know. And the more that they can see that, and YSEPs can help us do some of those things, I think the better off everybody is. The schools in Milwaukee could get better, and our research gets more application, more utilization. Our theories get advanced because schools change, communities change, cultures change. So the education theory and knowledge that we have now is going to be out of date in 5 years or in 10 years.
The question I would have with YSEPs, does the faculty member get a percentage back, or a high percentage, a low percentage back for these products and commercialization?
Do you want to answer that? Yeah.
Depends on the dean.
Depends on the amount of work that needs to be done, but there's a percentage that goes back to the unit, and a percentage that goes back to the individual, not necessarily a faculty member, because there are lots of people on this campus who do things, not just faculty, but on the individual and then the unit. It wants to go back there.
This is just off the top of my head, but what you're doing is you're setting up an alternative an alternative incentive system. So if one is doing basic research on what Paul suggested, and Allan was talking about leadership as an organizational condition or a distributed condition that does not have a commercial outlet, but has a potentially has a major impact on schools and the training programs and preparation programs. But there's no incentive for doing that. Why would, you know, except through your own core values, why would you do that versus designing a principal training program, you know, or an organizational training program in leadership that then can be commercialized? You know, and how does that draw faculty towards one or another of these, you know, these efforts?
Panelists, do either of you have a comment on this, or Paul?
Well, I was just thinking about the commodification of education as you were talking, and I have been following the local news back in Wisconsin, and one of the things that I know a few policymakers have brought up is that, well, you know, when those people graduate, we ought to figure out what the value of their education was based on their first job that they get when they get out and what they're getting paid for that job. And that would tell us whether that education was valuable or not. Well, I got to tell you right now, my education in my master's degree at Wisconsin in the visual plasticity of the poetry of Cesar Vallejo wouldn't have gotten crap for a salary. But what it did do is it gave me those analytic skills, it gave me those ways of critiquing ideas, and I think we need to be very careful when we begin to think of, so what's the value of an idea? And make it a commodity that is exchangeable, because before you know it, there'll be Walmart set up all over for these ideas, and in fact, they've invaded our higher education institutions already. Sorry, I get a little excited, and it's time for wine.
So what time is it over there, Pablo?
It's 20 to 12, and I'm way ahead of you guys. Yeah, the sun is just about down now. It's just starting to get dark. So.
Well, as Jimmy Buffett says, it's always 20 to 12 somewhere.
Oh, that's fine. Well, we have one last question, and given the hour, Paul, we'll let you go first, and then we can get going. But we wanted to give you an opportunity, I think, in various ways. Everyone in this room has benefited from your mentorship individually and collectively. And so we wanted to know what words of advice you would have either for the students in the room who are embarking brand new on issues of education research, for the emerging scholars, our new faculty in the room, and of course, even for those of us who are still chugging away and want to keep moving. So what advice would you have for people entering or moving forward in the field of education research?
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. And first of all, just let me thank all of you for organizing the Festschrift. Rich and Carolyn and all of my colleagues here and all of the other emeriti faculty, the alumni who've come back. How wonderful to see you. And it was just great. And I also want to have just a couple words for the dean. One is, what's the stuff about my photo? And that's the quietest you've seen me in a long time. And the other thing is for the other Julie. Now, I just want to remind you that I'll need some office space when I come back. I want to put that on the public record. Sorry? Oh, yes, with a Lakeview. No. If I were giving a couple pieces of advice to new people in the field and our students in that, the first that I would say is pursue what you care about, what you have a passion about, what you really want to do. There will be lots of people along the way who will try to dissuade you and move you in different directions and say, well, you really ought to be doing this, and you really ought to be thinking about it this way. But pursue what you care about, which isn't that you can't find help in listening to others and what their ideas are. But I think we need to do that. And the last thing I would say is, ours is a global field, and please think, look, and act outside the U.S. And it's a big world out there, and we have lots to learn from it. So that would be my last suggestion. And to all of you, I hope you can see me. Well, here we are.
Allan, would you like to go?
I'm going to take a little different direction than Paul.
You don't have your glass of wine
I don't have my wine. I guess one of the things I'd throw out for Wisconsin is figure out how to close the achievement gap. We got a big, bad achievement gap in this state. It's gotten worse and worse, even though money has gone up. It's been modest lately, but it's not getting better. Unless Wisconsin, I mean, the country's got to figure that out, but I think we're better positioned to figure it out here. So yes, follow your passion, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But, that's a driving issue for this state. And I don't think we've made much of a headway in coming up with cracking that nut. And until we crack that nut, we're going to have issues in this state. I don't want to say they're equity, they're going to just be real issues. So I would say that's where the focus needs to be.
Allan?
There are so many topics, so many objectives of educational research, and so having the encouragement of people to pursue what they care about and what's significant for society is great. I'm again picking up on Al Phelps' comment earlier, as well as Paul's most recently, and that is to say something about the methods of that research. when I first started attending American Education Research Association meetings in the early 1950s, it was quantitative with a vengeance. And little by little, over a decade or two, more and more acceptance of more qualitative approaches to research began to creep in. And so my main point, I think, for students as well as young faculty members is either what you do personally or the people with whom you collaborate, look at the benefits of combining both quantitative research and the strengths that it has and qualitative research, because the combination of the two many times is the way in which Allan and Paul, I think, indicated, the way that needs to be pursued in order to really make a difference, and a two-way street between practice on the one hand and scholarship on the other.
I'd like to reframe the question a little bit into...
You can't answer your own question.
Well, you know you can't drive after that. Norway has, I don't know, 0.05 rules or something.
0.02.
Almost zero
0.02.
Almost zero tolerance. Yep.
Wow. But, you know, words of advice for people entering educational research or, you know, the inquiry of practice, because practice is a form of inquiry and research. You know, I think focusing on core values, I don't disagree with you, Allan, at all about the importance of the achievement gap, but if you're really driving yourself, you've got to have core values around something. And perhaps it's the achievement gap, perhaps it's understanding school culture, perhaps it's understanding these networks. What did you call them?
Networked improvement communities.
Yes, fantastic idea. But having, you know, a really, an ambition, and I think ambition's a good thing but for what? If ambition is for the good, and especially I think the common good, I think that could be a driving force. Asking yourself, you know, how do you want to make a difference? When you look back on your career, how do you want to see it? In the dollars you've made, in the people you've affected, in the ideas you've put out, and maybe no one's read them yet, but they just might. But how do you want to make a difference? And to do that, I think there are two things. One is you have to just say no. You know, the old drug, you know, DARE program, just say no. You know, you can't do the things that you want to do if you are constantly, and you're all smart people, people are going to be asking you to do things that really aren't, you know, focused on your core idea and ambition of making a difference. And it'll sidetrack you. So just say no. And I think looking for some sort of coherence in your practice, your inquiry of practice, or your research over time. You know, I mean, it's great to do a lot of studies of a lot of different things, but most people, and I don't know if the research is solid on this, but someone was saying that if you spend 3,000 hours in an area, you can become an expert, or become
10,000.
10,000. Oh shoot! I've got a few more to. It's all right. You know, but if you have some coherence in what you're trying to accomplish, if you know, at some point you're going to make a major difference, whether it's in the inquiry of practice or more traditional research. That's my view.
Well, I can't really add anything that hasn't been already put on the table. And I go back, I think, to what Allan said at the beginning. Whether we're sifting and winnowing or we're trying to advance the public engagement in using research and knowledge more effectively under the the Wisconsin idea. Those are basic ideas that this institution represents, and I think the future demands for us to make a much more explicit connection between those two. So we can sift and winnow, but if we are not sifting and winnowing on things that the public cares about, our theory and our research are not going to be advancing, you know, and at the same time, those problems are going to continue, like Allan says, the achievement gap will continue to get better unless we get more theory and research applied to things that matter. And I think that's how the public has to see this university and see all of the work that goes on here. And this is a phenomenally rich environment with, you know, with really smart people on the faculty and really smart students at this institution. And I think just doing more work on the things that we explicitly want to care about, the big ideas, is where we need to be.
Good luck.
Yes. It's time for cocktails and golf.
I think exactly that's it. I'd like to thank each of you for all of your contributions. Both
Thank you.